He left his Montana ranch 5 years ago and never looked back. When he finally returned, strangers were living in his home, someone was trying to take his land, and his German Shepherd was the only one who saw the threat coming. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. The highway into Duskwater, Montana didn't welcome anyone. It just ended, the same way most things in Ethan Cole's life had ended, quietly, without ceremony, without warning. He'd been driving since before sunrise. The old green pickup loaded with nothing worth mentioning, the heater working just well enough to keep the windshield clear. Snow came sideways across the road in thin sheets, and the mountains ahead looked like they hadn't moved in 1,000 years. Maybe they hadn't. Ethan was 36 years old. He had a partial hearing loss in his left ear from a roadside bomb outside Mosul, a discharge paper folded in his jacket pocket, and a ranch he hadn't seen in 5 years sitting somewhere past the next ridge. He didn't think of himself as broken. He thought of himself as someone who had learned to stand at a slight angle so the world sounded more even. In the passenger seat, Ghost sat perfectly still. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, black and tan, built like something carved rather than born, with amber eyes that didn't watch the road so much as read it. Ghost had worked EOD alongside Ethan in the same unit, had sniffed the same dirt roads, had been close enough to the same explosion that the blast caught his left hind leg, enough to leave a scar along the muscle that tightened in cold weather, and made him favorite on mornings like this one, when the temperature dropped below freezing before sunrise. Neither of them talked about it. That was maybe the most honest thing about their relationship. On the seat between them sat a single envelope, return address from a company called Apex Land Solutions, signed by an attorney named Vincent Marsh. Inside, a notice claiming Coldstone Ridge Ranch owed $40,000 in back taxes, collectible in 30 days. Ethan had found a different notice in his mailbox 3 weeks earlier. A county notice, $18,000. He'd kept both. He didn't know yet what that difference meant. He suspected it meant everything. Ghost refused to get out of the truck. That was the first thing. Ethan pulled up the long dirt road toward the ranch house, cut the engine, opened his door, and stood in 6 inches of snow while the cold hit him the way Montana cold always did. Not all at once, but from every direction simultaneously, finding the gaps. He said Ghost's name once. The dog sat motionless in the passenger seat, a low vibration moving through his chest. Not quite a growl, more like a frequency only the two of them could read. Ethan didn't push. He'd learned that Ghost's hesitation was a language, and ignoring it was like ignoring a smoke detector because you didn't smell anything yet. He circled the property from the west on foot, moving slowly, reading the ground. Someone had repaired the north fence with fresh timber and salvaged wire. The barn roof had new boards along the east edge. Firewood was stacked under a tarp near the porch, not casually thrown there, but stacked the way someone stacks wood when they're planning to survive the winter, not just get through a weekend. Smoke came from the chimney. Ethan stood in the yard and looked at that smoke for a long moment. Then he gave Ghost the all-clear signal. The dog stepped down from the truck, moved directly to the east gate, and stopped beside a set of boot prints in the snow, smaller than Ethan's, pressed deep, pointing toward the barn. Someone had been here within the last 24 hours. Not the couple inside. Someone else. Ethan filed that away and walked to the front door. It opened before he knocked. Harold Simmons was 74 years old, lean as January, with white hair and hands so scarred from decades of work they looked like a map of somewhere difficult. He looked at Ethan without flinching. He said, "I knew someone would come back, I just didn't know when." He stepped back from the door and added, without being asked, that a county land officer named Purcell had come to the door 2 winters ago, offering to arrange a caretaker placement, someone to keep the property from falling into disrepair while the taxes were being sorted. Harold had agreed to stay for no rent in exchange for maintenance. He had the letter from Purcell in the kitchen drawer if Ethan wanted to see it. Ethan asked to see it that evening. The letterhead was genuine county stationery. Purcell, Harold said, had retired the following spring. Nothing about the letter suggested anything other than a routine placement. Behind him, Dorothy Simmons stood with one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, her fingers trembling in the small involuntary way they always did now. She looked at Ghost, who had followed Ethan to the porch, and said softly, "That dog has been somewhere terrible." She wasn't wrong. Ghost walked past Harold without being invited and went directly to Dorothy. He didn't sniff her hand or circle her the way dogs do with strangers. He simply walked to where she was standing, sat down beside her chair, and rested his head against her knee. Dorothy didn't flinch. She placed her trembling hand on top of his head the way a nurse places a hand on a patient's arm, not for herself, but for him. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched this and said nothing. In 5 years of working alongside Ghost through deployments and disaster zones and the long gray months after discharge, he had never seen the dog do that with anyone. Harold gave Ethan a brief tour of the house, and what struck Ethan wasn't what had changed, but what hadn't. His father's tools hung in the same order on the workshop wall, the photograph above the fireplace, his parents at the ranch gate, summer sometime in the 90s, had been cleaned recently. The frame dusted, the glass clear. His mother's reading chair was in the same corner. Everything had been kept to be respectful. Later that evening, Harold led Ethan into the back bedroom and reached behind the bookshelf near the window. He produced a leather journal, brown and soft with age, and held it out without explanation. Ethan recognized his father's handwriting on the cover. Not a name, just 2 words, The Ranch. Harold said he'd found it wedged behind the shelf when he was repairing the plaster. He said he'd read it and hoped that was all right. Ethan took the journal and sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. His father wrote about winters, about quiet mornings, about a partner named Gerald Fitch who had wanted to buy mineral rights 22 years ago. And when Ethan's father had refused and ended the partnership, Fitch had said, "You'll regret this land." Ethan turned the page slowly. Outside, snow moved across the ridge like something patient. Vincent Marsh arrived 2 days later in a black SUV that looked like it had never been on an unpaved road before and was quietly offended by the experience. He was 47, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples and the kind of easy smile that took years of practice to make look natural. His coat was cashmere. His boots were clean. Not ranch clean, but genuinely, deliberately clean, as though the mud of Duskwater didn't apply to him. Ghost stood up the moment Marsh stepped out of the SUV. The man moved with a particular kind of stillness, shoulders relaxed, hands visible, the practiced ease of someone who had spent years making entrances, and something in that stillness, too deliberate, too composed for an unannounced visit to a stranger's property in a snowstorm, reached Ghost before it reached Ethan. The dog didn't bark or move forward. He simply stood at Ethan's left side and fixed his amber eyes on Vincent Marsh with an attention so complete and unblinking that Marsh glanced at the dog 3 times. In the first 30 seconds, each time recalibrating his smile, Marsh introduced himself warmly, referred to Ethan as friend on first meeting, and explained that Apex Land Solutions was simply trying to help families avoid the ugly machinery of county seizure. He offered $280,000 for the property. He said it like a kindness. Ethan listened without expression. That night, Harry sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I taught history for 35 years. The men who caused the most damage were never the ones who shouted. They were the ones who said, 'I'm just trying to help you,' while sliding a paper across the table." He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Ethan. "Your guard drops for a polite man. That's exactly what he's counting on." After Marsh left, Ghost led Ethan to the east gate, directly, without hesitation. Pressed against the lowest strand of barbed wire was a torn piece of navy blue fabric, work jacket material. Ethan put it in a plastic bag. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photographs Harold had taken 2 months earlier of the private geological survey crew working the ridge. Navy blue jackets, all of them. 3 mornings after Marsh's visit, Ghost refused to leave the feed storage shed. Ethan called him twice. The dog sat in front of the shed door and looked back at him with the particular stillness that meant this is not stubbornness. This is information. Ethan went inside and started moving hay. Beneath the 3rd layer, pressed against the base of the center post, he found a small plastic container of gasoline, sealed with a rag tucked beneath it. Someone had been inside the shed. Ethan removed the container, replaced the hay exactly as he'd found it, and mounted a small motion camera above the door before walking back to the house without telling Harold or Dorothy. That same afternoon, Harold knocked something over in the barn, a metal bucket that hit the frozen concrete floor with a sharp crack, and Ghost collapsed against the far wall, trembling, breathing in the fast, shallow rhythm that Ethan knew too well because he heard his own breath do the same thing sometimes in the dark. He ran to the barn. Harold was already standing back, pale, one hand pressed to his mouth. Ethan sat down on the barn floor beside Ghost without speaking, without reaching for him, just sat there in the cold until the dog's breathing slowed. Harold watched from the doorway. Dorothy appeared behind him, took one look at the scene, and disappeared back into the house. She returned with an old wool blanket and draped it gently over Ghost's back. She said, "This dog has been protecting people for a long time." She paused. "It's someone's turn to protect him." Ethan didn't look up, but something in his jaw released, a tension so old he'd stopped noticing it. And for a moment he looked less like a man standing watch and more like someone who was almost, cautiously, beginning to rest. The storm came in hard on a Thursday, sleet first and then wind, the kind of Montana night that makes a building feel temporary. Ethan was in the barn checking the electrical lines when Ghost barked. One bark, short, declarative, the way the dog had been trained to signal a find. Not fear, a report. Ethan was out the door in 4 seconds. The West hay storage was burning, not smoldering, burning, orange and fast, fed by something that wasn't just hay. The east shed, where he'd pulled the original container and replaced it with nothing, was untouched. Either Bobby hadn't checked the shed before lighting the west storage, or he'd reached in, found the container gone, and made a decision Ethan hadn't anticipated to proceed with only one location rather than none. Whoever had set this had prepared 2 locations, only one had been used. Harold was already out of the house, moving toward the horse stall in his coat and boots, calling for Copper, the old roan gelding that a neighbor named Dietz had boarded for 2 years after Ethan left, and which Harold had brought back to the property when he took over the caretaking. The horse was his father's last animal, the only one left on the property. Ethan shouted for him to stop. Harold didn't stop. He was inside the barn before Ethan reached the door, and then the smoke hit and Harold went down hard, shoulder first against the frozen ground, and didn't get up quickly. Ethan got to him, pulled him back from the doorway. Harold was conscious, breathing. His left shoulder dropped at an angle that didn't look right. Ethan told him not to move his arm. Harold told him to get the horse. Copper was still inside. Ghost went in without a command, favoring his left side the way he did in cold air, moving fast anyway. Ethan heard him before he could see him, a rhythmic bark, evenly spaced, the cadence Ghost used in the field to guide rather than alarm. It was a sound Copper's instincts understood before his fear could override them. The horse came through the door at a run with Ghost at his flank, both of them moving into the cold air just before the first ceiling beam came down. The volunteer fire crew from Duskwater arrived 40 minutes after the blaze started and kept it from spreading to the main barn. They filed a report noting accelerant involvement. Ethan gave them nothing beyond what they could see. The next morning, he found the water line near the eastern hill had been cut. A clean cut, not a freeze break. Someone had done it the same night as the fire, or close to it. He patched it temporarily with a hose clamp from the barn, said nothing to Harold, and photographed the cut end before he covered it. He kept the photograph. He would need it later. The motion camera above the east shed had caught everything, a figure in a navy jacket. The face was partially obscured by the weather, but the name came to Ethan from a different direction. The build, the way the man moved, the old Crane family truck visible at the edge of the frame, a dented blue Ford that Ethan had seen parked in the same spot off the county road since before he'd left. Bobby Crane, who had grown up 2 miles down the road, whose family had lost 80 acres the previous year. Ethan watched the footage twice to be sure. Then he put on his coat. Ghost was already at the truck door. Bobby Crane answered the door, looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks and had made peace with that. He was 28, but carried it differently. Older in the eyes, younger in the way his hands moved, uncertain and quick, the hands of someone still waiting for consequences to arrive. When Ethan said, "I know what you did," Bobby didn't deny it. He stepped back from the door and sat down at his kitchen table, and Ethan sat across from him, and Ghost settled under the table between, calm, chin and resting on his paws, unbothered. Bobby watched the dog for a moment. Then he started talking. Vincent Marsh had approached him 4 months after his family lost their land. Marsh had been warm, sympathetic, thorough in his explanation of how the county system worked and how it had failed the Crane family. He'd explained that the coal property was going to be seized regardless, and that if the process moved faster, without complications, a compensation fund would be activated to repay displaced families in the area. Bobby had believed him because Marsh was patient and precise, and spoke about justice the way a man speaks about something he personally intends to deliver. Bobby hadn't known he was being used. He'd thought he was fighting for his family. Ethan listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Before Ethan left, Bobby went to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the printed email, the coordination document Marsh had sent him, the one referencing 7 properties and a timeline. He put it on the table without saying anything. Ethan took it and left. Harold had told him once about a student who flinched every time the school bell rang, and how the other kids laughed, and how Harold had silenced them. Not because the boy was without fault in other things, but because understanding what shaped a person mattered before deciding what to do with them. Ethan drove back to the ranch that night and sat on the porch steps with Ghost beside him and thought about the difference between a man who caused harm and a man who was aimed like a weapon by someone else, and whether that difference changed what came next. He decided it did. Sheriff Dana Ruiz was 40 years old and had the particular composure of someone who had learned early that being the most competent person in a room was sometimes easier and sometimes harder than it looked. She looked at Ghost once when they came in, said nothing about it, and watched the motion camera footage once. Read the printed email Ethan had brought in, the coordination document Bobby had handed to Ethan, which Bobby had received directly from Marsh as part of what Marsh had framed as a timeline for the compensation fund, referencing 7 properties, 2 complete, 5 remaining, and then she sat quietly for a moment before asking Ethan why he hadn't called her the night of the fire. He told her he'd wanted to understand first. She said, "That's exactly what I need from a witness." Ghost, who had been sitting beside the door, walked across the office and licked Dana's hand while she was reading. She looked up, startled, then laughed, a real laugh, brief and surprised. The kind that happens before a person can decide whether to allow it. She said, "This dog is smarter than most people I've interviewed." Marcus Webb showed up at the ranch 2 days later with water tanks in his truck and a toolbox under one arm. He hadn't been called. He'd heard what happened from Ray Puente, who drove the county road grader and had been the one to call the volunteer fire crew the night of the blaze, and who had mentioned the following morning at the Duskwater fuel station that someone was trying to hold on to their father's land out on Cold Stone Ridge. Marcus had listened, finished his coffee, and driven out. He'd lost his left leg in Kandahar and moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped accommodating the inconvenience. He said he hadn't been able to do that for his own father and figured this was a reasonable second chance. Ruth Calloway arrived the same afternoon with the box of letters she'd been keeping for 18 months, 34 envelopes, unusual correspondence sent to farming families across the county. At the bottom of the box was an unsigned handwritten letter warning, "Don't sign anything Marsh gives you." Dana recognized the handwriting. A county office clerk named Pauline Greer, who had resigned abruptly 6 months earlier after filing an internal complaint about irregularities in the tax assessment records. A complaint that had been reviewed and dismissed by the same assessor's office that Fitch's contractor worked inside. Pauline had known better than to go further without protection. The letter in Ruth's box was the only move she'd felt safe making. The county tax deadline was 14 days out. After that, the seizure process could begin. The next 10 days moved the way difficult things move, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular weight of work that matters. A doctor from Duskwater confirmed Harold's shoulder was badly bruised, but not broken. Harold wore a sling for the first 2 days and spent both of them at the kitchen table anyway, reading with his good hand and using his chin to hold pages flat against the table when he needed to write something down, which Dorothy said was the most Harold thing she had ever seen. 4 days before the county deadline, the ranch became something it hadn't been before, a working center, people moving in and out with purpose, the kind of organized effort that happens when enough individuals decide that a thing is worth saving. Marcus ran power to the outbuildings and fixed the water line that someone had cut near the eastern hill. Bobby Crane showed up on the second morning without being asked. He stood at the gate for a moment before Ethan opened it, and neither of them said anything about why he was there or whether he had the right to be. Ethan handed him a work list. Bobby took it, carried lumber without speaking much, and worked until dark. Harold sat at the kitchen table each night with Ethan, sorting through documents, applying the same methodical intelligence he'd once used to teach 8th graders how to read primary sources, looking for what was missing and why. Dorothy kept the kitchen warm and the table fed, her hands trembling over the stove, but her timing exact, the food always ready when it was needed. Ghost moved through all of it, checking the perimeter in the evenings, returning to the house when the work went late, settling near whoever had gone quiet first. Then Marsh's attorney withdrew from the case with 48 hours remaining. Dana had contacted Marsh 3 days before that, quietly, without filing anything, and laid out what she had. The footage, the coordination document Ethan had brought in from Bobby, the letters in Ruth's box, Pauline Greer's complaint. Marsh had asked for 48 hours to consider his position. He used them. On the second day, he called Dana and told her he knew how to bring Fitch in. Dana told him she would be in Billings. A day after his attorney withdrew, Marsh drove out to the ranch alone. Ghost heard the car before Ethan did and was at the window, still watching. When Ethan saw who it was, he told Harold to stay inside and walk to the gate himself. Marsh had no SUV entourage, no clean boots energy. He stopped at the gate and didn't try to open it. He told Ethan that Gerald Fitch would not stop just because Marsh had. He said it the way a man says something he should have said years earlier and knows it. Ethan thanked him and watched him leave. Then Marsh made the call to Denver. 12 hours after that, Dana called from Billings. Gerald Fitch had flown in from Denver exactly as Marsh had told him to, trusting that Marsh was still operating on his behalf, unaware that Marsh had already agreed to cooperate with Dana's office in exchange for reduced charges. Fitch had brought the private geological survey with him, the original copy, the one Marsh had told him he would need to present in order to establish mineral rights priority in any forced settlement. He was arrested at the airport gate in Billings. In his carry-on luggage, the geological survey mapping a copper vein running beneath the eastern ridge of Coldstone Ridge Ranch, estimated value in the tens of millions. Ethan's father had written about the strange color of that rock 2 years after Fitch left, a detail without context, a question he'd never thought to answer. The taxes were corrected to $18,000. Among the documents recovered from Fitch's carry-on luggage was a series of correspondence between Fitch and a contractor inside the county assessor's office, showing that the $40,000 figure on the Apex Land Solutions notice had been fabricated, inflated beyond the actual county record to create a gap large enough to justify the seizure timeline Marsh needed. The county adjusted the record and opened a separate investigation into the assessor's office the same week. The community of Duskwater made up the difference in 9 days. It didn't come all at once. Ruth started a ledger at the store counter. No sign, no announcement, just a ledger, and people came in ones and twos with checks and cash, some with amounts so small they apologized for it. And Ruth told each one that the amount didn't matter. The fact of it did. A hardware supplier in Billings that Ethan's father had done business with for 30 years, whose name Harold had found in the back of the ranch ledger, sent a check without explanation. By the 9th day, the ledger was closed. Nobody made a ceremony of it. Bobby Crane accepted a deferred prosecution agreement, 200 hours of community service, full restitution for the damage to the hay storage, and 2 years of supervised probation in exchange for no criminal filing. Ethan had proposed the framework to Dana. Dana had taken it to the county attorney, who had agreed on the condition that Bobby's cooperation as a witness against Marsh and Fitch was documented and complete. Bobby signed. He didn't hesitate, and he didn't look relieved. He looked like a man who had finally found something useful to do with what he'd done wrong. Bobby stayed on at the ranch and worked in a way that suggested he understood what he owed and intended to pay it in the only currency that mattered. Harold and Dorothy didn't leave. The question never came up. Harold found a corner of the old equipment barn and began building small pieces. Careful work, the kind a man does when he finally has enough quiet to find out what his hands know. When the county clerk's office sent the final clearance letter 3 weeks later, and the property was legally Ethan's again without condition or encumbrance, Harold picked up the journal from the kitchen table. It had lived there for weeks, passed back and forth between them during the document work, and read aloud a passage. The best land is land that feeds more than one family. He said he thought they should do something with that. They did. The converted outbuilding became Ridge House, a few rooms, a working kitchen, a place for displaced families and struggling veterans to land when they had nowhere else. Marcus ran the electrical. Bobby framed the interior walls, the first 40 hours of his community service, though nobody kept count out loud. Harold built the furniture in the corner of the equipment barn, piece by piece, and carried each piece over himself. It took 3 months. Harold carved the sign by hand. Dorothy cried when she saw it finished. The last entry in his father's journal was written in pencil, faint enough that Ethan had to tilt the page toward the light to read it. If you're reading this, you came back. That's enough. Ethan sat with that for a long time. The grief came later, quietly, the way things come when the body finally believes it's safe. That evening he sat on the porch steps as the sky went dark over the ridge. Ghost was beside him. Harold and Dorothy were inside. Marcus had driven out from Duskwater that afternoon to check the water pump. He came once a month now, unasked, and was still at the fence, humming something tuneless. Bobby was stacking wood near the east gate, unhurried. Ethan watched the light go and didn't think about anything in particular. Then Ghost stood up and looked out toward the road, ears forward, tail moving slowly. There was nothing there. No truck, no threat. The dog was simply looking at the horizon and finding it good. Ethan followed his gaze. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't scan for danger. He just looked. And for the first time since he'd left, he wasn't standing at an angle. He was standing straight, and the world sounded even anyway. If this story stayed with you, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment and tell us, which moment hit you hardest? And where in the world are you watching from tonight?
Saturday and when the world does, Ethan Cross came home to a ranch that had been taken. A ranch had been fabricated and conspiracy built by men who mistook silence for weakness. He had patio hearing an audition paper and a dog named was a Sapphire who has survived the same experience, carries the same scar, and never once stopped paying attention. What this story teaches us is simple and profound. Healing is not a slur. It took a 74-year-old school teacher who kept another man home like it was can. A traveling woman who hands took but who has never did. A pearl veteran who drove out wizards being cruel. A some man who caused harm but true to become something better. Not of them were held by killer. They were ordinary people who decide just one man land, one family dignity was worth showing up for, and was he remind us that loyalty doesn't need language. That sometimes the most honest, love simple, sit beside you and stay. The disparate lesson community is not a place. It's a choice people make again and again. When things get hard, when you protect what matters, lens through disorder, you don't just save a rent. You build a whole world coming back to